The Ford Scorpio made its debut in 1985. The same year Doc Brown invented the time machine, Marty McFly dreamed of a Toyota, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party in the USSR, and the action film Commando hit the big screen. Ford's new car turned out to be large, comfortable, practical, and relatively affordable, attracting decent demand, especially from buyers looking to get the most car for their money. Automotive journalists also greeted it with generally positive reviews, though there were a few caveats. First, Ford released the Scorpio exclusively as a 5-door hatchback, emphasizing the practicality of the rear door. But in the mid-'80s, not every buyer was ready to abandon the traditional sedan, particularly among the conservative clientele of large Fords. This had a noticeable impact on sales, prompting Ford to make corrections. In 1989, the sedan version was introduced, and in 1992, alongside a facelift, the station wagon followed. This big Ford, popular with corporate fleets and frugal owners, was also produced in extreme versions. For off-road enthusiasts, there was a 4-wheel drive variant, and for speed lovers, British firm Cosworth developed the powerful engine for the Scorpio. Each of these atypical models earned coverage in the automotive press. The Scorpio itself debuted in early 1985, while the 4x4 version was saved for the Frankfurt Motor Show, where journalists got to test it before its official premiere. This variant was very expensive, the most expensive Ford in Europe, priced at 44,500 Deutschmarks. For that amount, one could buy a Mercedes-Benz W124 with a 3-liter engine or a base BMW 7 Series with a 2.8-liter engine. Adding 5,000 more could even get you into the refreshed S-Class. The Mercedes-Benz W126 with a 2.6-liter engine cost just over 50,000. Meanwhile, the base Scorpio with a 1.8-liter engine was half the price. So Ford charged a hefty premium for all-wheel drive on the big Scorpio. Under the hood was the old V-shaped 6-cylinder engine with a displacement of 2.8 liters and an output of 150 horsepower. By spring of the following year, 1986, Ford promised a new generation of V6 engines, and the automotive press was already writing about the 2.9-liter version in the fall of '85. Still, 150 horses handled the increased weight well. Engineers had wisely shortened the final drive ratio. The factory claimed the all-wheel drive version could accelerate to 109.9 seconds and reach a top speed of 203 kilometers per hour. Back then, breaking the 10-second barrier and exceeding 200 was a big deal. But the main highlight of the car was, of course, its all-wheel drive system. The design was already familiar with the Ford Sierra, but the transmission was adapted for the larger, heavier vehicle. The drive shaft was lengthened, but the core layout remained unchanged. Through the Getrag transfer case, 66% of torque was sent to the rear wheels by default and 34% to the front. Both the rear and center differentials featured viscous couplings, acting as automatic locks, a common and driver-friendly solution for differential locking. In Audi Quattro models of that era, the locking mechanisms had to be engaged manually. More importantly, unlike simpler permanent all-wheel drive systems, viscous couplings allowed the use of anti-lock braking systems alongside four-wheel drive. One of Ford Scorpio's technical advantages over its rivals was the inclusion of ABS as standard across all versions, while other manufacturers at the time charged extra for it, and not a small amount. Audi would soon revise its all-wheel drive design to accommodate ABS in newer models. As for the Ford Scorpio bearing the 4x4 badge, it was virtually indistinguishable from rear-wheel drive cars under normal conditions. The cabin lacked any extra levers or transmission control buttons, and there was no indication of drivetrain operation, unlike in Mercedes vehicles. German journalists noted during early test drives that the car gripped dry asphalt better during hard acceleration, and in tight corners under load, there was no hint of wheel spin. Overall, its behavior resembled that of rear-wheel drive variants, with their tendency to oversteer, which, however, was easy to control. A slightly stiffer suspension, no chrome trim, and standard 15-inch alloy wheels fitted with Italian Pirelli P6 tires, size 205 by 60 VR15. That was essentially all that visually set the most expensive Ford apart from its more modest siblings. Ford's press office envisioned this version as ideal for a rural doctor heading out on a snowy emergency call. Journalists, however, suggested that buyers would choose the Scorpio 4x4 more for image reasons, though even that assumption sparked debate, considering the car's price and its competitors. To explore all the nuances, German testers conducted a full-scale evaluation of the vehicle and later compared it with other all-wheel drive passenger cars. A few points are worth noting. First, Audi had to implement all-wheel drive in its road cars because front-wheel drive couldn't handle high power. But by the 1980s, Audi had so successfully turned the drawbacks of front-wheel drive into promotional advantages for all-wheel drive that it became almost unfashionable not to offer AWD in the lineup. All-wheel drive cars were winning rallies, and advertising emphasized the incredible safety of Ford-driven wheels. Owners of two-wheel drive cars began to feel inadequate. Yet German automotive journalists, despite the powerful wave of marketing, viewed AWD in regular road cars with a fair amount of skepticism. They explained to readers when it truly made sense, compared the behavior of different drivetrains, and urged realistic assessments of driving conditions and personal needs. They pointed out that rear-wheel drive BMWs, for example, drove more precisely and engagingly than their AWD counterparts, and that most front-wheel drive cars were just as safe on winter roads as vehicles with four-wheel drive badges. Thus, the detailed test of the top-tier Ford Scorpio with a 2.8-liter engine and all-wheel drive, conducted in early 1986, aimed to answer a key question: who really needs Ford-driven wheels in a passenger car? Journalists noted that from Ford's marketing perspective, this car was a major letdown. Externally, there was no sign of the transfer case, viscous couplings, or the shaft running through the oil pan, a real tragedy for tech enthusiasts. The only visual cues were 3 4x4 badges, one at the rear and one on each side. Still, up to 60 miles per hour, the all-wheel drive Scorpio accelerated faster than the rear-wheel drive version, just over 9 seconds versus nearly 10, thanks to a shorter final drive ratio. But by the time it reached 100 miles per hour, the 4x4 version took over 27 seconds, while the rear-wheel drive did it in under 26. At 112 miles per hour, the difference widened, more than 43 seconds versus just under 39. Top speed was slightly over 128 miles per hour for the AWD compared to 131 for the RWD. The difference might seem minor, especially considering the winter traction potential, but on German autobahns, these numbers carry more weight. Fuel consumption during testing reached nearly 15 liters per 100 kilometers for the 4x4, while the rear-wheel drive managed just over 12, and that mattered to buyers. So did the stiffer ride of the AWD version with its gas shocks, especially on small bumps and at low urban speeds. The worst part was the car's unpredictable cornering behavior. Despite advertising promises of safety on slippery roads, real-world performance varied with surface and load. Both understeer and oversteer could occur. Predicting whether the next turn would bring a slide or a skid was nearly impossible. If the driver added throttle during understeer, the car tended to drift outward on all four wheels. If they lifted off, a sharp oversteer could follow, hard to control. To be fair, German journalists noted that such extreme driving was beyond reasonable speeds for everyday drivers, and that applied to the rear-wheel drive version too. In daily use, the AWD offered clear advantages in traction on slippery roads, though it didn't eliminate the need for winter tires. Ultimately, the AWD version had inferior handling, less comfort, higher fuel consumption, and cost around $10,000 more. A steep price for questionable benefits, the Germans wrote. British journalists later tested the car too. all-wheel drive, a V6 engine, and straightforward conclusions in the opening of their Ford Scorpio 4x4 review. Pros, handling and space. Cons, performance and fuel economy. Like the Germans, they criticized Audi's all-wheel drive religion, noting that Ford's system came later but was technically more refined. Visually, aside from the badges and low-profile tires on alloy wheels, nothing hinted this was Ford's most expensive model. They also highlighted the use of viscous couplings in the center and rear differentials, limiting wheel slip and enabling ABS functionality. The top-spec 4x4 Scorpio added leather seats, cruise control, and a factory alarm, pushing its UK price above £20,000. And they believed the Scorpio 4x4 could easily handle more power than the 150 horses of its V6. They also tested a sharp launch not only on dry asphalt, but by placing one side of the car on soft ground. The Scorpio handled this confidently, remaining stable during acceleration. Interestingly, the British recorded a time of 9.4 seconds, up to 60 miles per hour, which equals 96 kilometers per hour on the continent. The difference between the all-wheel drive and rear-wheel drive versions turned out to be minimal, 9.4 versus 9.5 seconds, unlike the German models. This wasn't surprising. By then, Ford had started fitting a shorter final drive ratio even on standard cars. British journalists praised this decision, dropping earlier complaints about gear ratios. Everything now felt balanced, except for fuel consumption, which was excessively high. On the move, the car felt slightly stiffer, with more pronounced tire noise, but the overall impression of the Scorpio remained largely unchanged. However, cornering behavior was judged very differently by German and British reviewers. The British noted that the tendency to oversteer seen in the rear-wheel drive Scorpio was less noticeable in the all-wheel drive version. In regular driving modes, the Scorpio 4x4 allows the driver to tackle winding roads at remarkable speed, with handling and grip so good that driving becomes genuinely engaging. The car was described as intuitive and predictable, with steering earning the label flawless. Journalists detailed how smoothly the car transitions from a mild drift to a gentle trajectory correction when lifting off the throttle, instead of the expected slide, and how precisely it straightens out when power is reapplied. If desired, the car can be coaxed into a controlled drift, and its predictable behavior at the limit makes the big Ford enjoyable to drive even on wet roads. There was no sign of stubborn front-end push like in Audi models, and body roll was reduced thanks to a stronger front anti-roll bar, stiffer springs, and different dampers compared to the rear-wheel drive version. At the same time, the suspension offered generous travel, which journalists tested on Scotland's rough roads. It's hard to pinpoint why the same car received such different handling assessments, perhaps due to market-specific tuning, varying road conditions, different testing approaches, or divergent interpretations of limit speeds. In the UK, Ford traditionally holds a more prominent place in automotive culture than in Germany, but British journalists are ruthless when Ford releases a poor model. For example, the failed front-wheel drive Escort of the third generation was torn apart and forced the manufacturer to urgently revise the chassis after initial tests. Why the all-wheel drive Scorpio's behavior was judged so differently remains unclear. Journalists also commented on the rich equipment, a complex audio system with a cassette deck and graphic equalizer. It didn't sound as impressive as the Philips system in the Renault 25, but was still decent. And it avoided the oversized speaker cones found in the Renault's doors. They also mentioned the headphone jacks for rear passengers, the massive trunk, generous rear legroom, and the neatly molded tool holder in the spare wheel compartment. It was noted that the factory-installed alarm system is convenient, requiring no extra actions to activate. However, if you want to open the trunk, you'll first need to unlock the doors with the key. Otherwise, the alarm will go off when the fifth door is opened. Ergonomically, the Ford Scorpio was said to be hard to beat. The steering column adjusts for both angle and reach. The driver's seat features steepless electric adjustment, and the lumbar support is inflated manually with a rubber bulb. The test car also had a leather interior, which came at a significant extra cost. It was mentioned that the heated windshield could produce halos at night, noticeable under certain conditions, but something you could get used to. The anti-lock braking system was described in detail, featuring 2 microprocessors that constantly monitor not only sensor data, but also the sensor's functionality. The ABS could operate at up to 12 cycles per second, depending on road conditions. Overall, Ford was said to have done meticulous work on the all-wheel drive Scorpio. Ride quality remained excellent despite a stiffer suspension. Performance improved thanks to a shorter final drive ratio, and road grip was clearly better. Still, Ford was considered far from the Audi 200 Quattro, and even the more affordable front-wheel drive Renault 25 V6 Turbo was highly praised. Yet the British called the Scorpio 4x4 one of the safest cars they had ever driven. In terms of handling and road behavior, few could match it. And with the upcoming 2.9-liter engine, Ford was poised to become a clear leader. All-wheel drive vehicles, despite skepticism and articles in the automotive press, were gaining popularity. In 1985, their sales increased by 48%, although the absolute numbers were modest, around 300,000 units sold in Western Europe, representing 2.2% of the car market. In mountainous Switzerland, the share was 9.9%. In Austria, 5%. In Germany, 3.2%. In France, 1.7%. And in the UK, just 1.1%. The topic was trendy, almost like aerodynamics, and Ford Scorpio was perfectly aligned with current trends. Diesel engines were another story. Ford didn't have its own, so the Scorpio initially came with a Peugeot diesel, producing 69 horsepower. The Ford Scorpio 2.5D CL, with the French Peugeot diesel, this engine had been known since the Peugeot 403, was used in the 80s in the large Peugeot 505, and was famous for its reliability and longevity. Ford had already bought diesels from Peugeot. For example, the Sierra previously used a 2.3-liter engine. The Scorpio received a 2.5-liter unit. Its 69 horsepower accelerated the heavy car, weighing around 1,340 kilograms, to 100 kilometers per hour in 22.4 seconds. That was incredibly slow, even by the standards of the time, though it allowed the car to keep up with traffic reasonably well. The lack of a turbo forced compromises. Ford sacrificed performance by choosing a specific final drive ratio, but after a leisurely acceleration, the diesel Scorpio allowed for relaxed and fairly comfortable cruising on the Autobahn. Driving had to be leisurely due to a top speed of 158 kilometers per hour. The diesel Mercedes 200D, for instance, reached 169, which allowed for a higher cruising speed on long trips. In the city, the Scorpio with its French naturally aspirated diesel kept up with traffic, though on winding and hilly regional roads, its dynamics were clearly lacking. Fuel efficiency wasn't its strong suit either. 9.1 liters per 100 kilometers during testing, quite a bit compared to the Mercedes, which managed 8.4 in real-world conditions. Still, the more advanced Mercedes diesel cost 34,280 Deutsche Marks, while the Ford was priced at 27,620. The Scorpio's fuel tank held 70 liters, theoretically enabling nearly 800 kilometers on a single fill-up. Not bad for a spacious car. Road comfort was also solid. The faster the car went, the less noticeable the diesel engine noise became, fading into the background on the Autobahn. In the city, however, there was no doubt it was a diesel. German journalists noted the engine responded to throttle input with a rumble reminiscent of trucks, yet vibrations were minimal, even at idle. Calm, pure calm. That was the defining trait of the diesel Ford Scorpio. Peugeot, meanwhile, had a turbo diesel, subtly mentioned by journalists to Ford, and within a couple of years it found its way under the Scorpio's hood. 92 horsepower, side-mounted camshaft, Ford Scorpio 2.5 turbo diesel, famed for its indestructible engine and acceleration to 100 kilometers per hour in exactly 15 seconds. Still far from a record, but much closer to late 1980s standards than the 22 seconds of the naturally aspirated version. Top speed also increased. 171 kilometers per hour. At low speeds, noise persisted, especially during startup, when the French diesel emitted a thick cloud of smoke, but it started reliably even in cold weather. The turbo diesel version's weight rose to 1,407 kilograms, and fuel consumption climbed to 9.6 liters per 100 kilometers. That was considerable. Newer turbo diesels consumed noticeably less, but still about a quarter less than the gasoline-powered Scorpio. The French turbo diesel variant cost 35,635 Deutschmarks in early 1989. Overall, only about 4% of buyers opted for diesel-powered Ford Scorpios. Few chose the version with a V6 and 4 valves per cylinder, developed for Ford by its longtime partner Cosworth. Ford engines were fined by British engineers shown on Formula One tracks and brought rally victories. Road cars with the Cosworth badge and massive spoilers were the dream of working-class enthusiasts worldwide. But the Ford Scorpio with a V6 producing 195 horsepower received only a modest 24V badge, indicating valve count. The Cosworth name appeared only under the hood. Rumor had it the reason was the notorious reputation of the Ford Sierra Cosworth, which was so popular that insuring it was virtually impossible. That's why the large Scorpio, aimed at corporate clients and confident mid-level managers as a flagship version, lost its important suffix. The engine itself dated back to 1964, and in its two-valve form, powered production Scorpios with 145 horsepower and a catalytic converter. Its block became the foundation for the Cosworth unit. In the Cosworth version, high power and torque were achieved at significantly higher revs, and German journalists, having tested the car, noted that under partial load, much of that power and torque increase seemed to vanish somewhere deep within the transmission with its long final drive ratio. Only at high revs did the 4-valve engine with 4 overhead camshafts truly come alive. More precisely, it revealed the typical character of 4-valve engines with 2 camshafts per cylinder bank, unlike their 2-valve counterparts, which pulled well from low revs but faded as revs climbed. Engineers made these engines slightly duller at low speeds, shifting the power band toward the top end. A great recipe for race cars, but for everyday driving, the character was debatable. As for Ford's V6 developed with Cosworth, it was said to still fall short of the best examples of the time, the 4-valve 6-cylinder engines from BMW and Mercedes, which easily revved to 7,000. Ford literally lagged behind. Its red line was 6,000, and peak power came at 5,800. The car's character was also shaped by the automatic transmission, which was made standard on the 24-valve version, since 83% of Scorpio buyers with the regular V6 opted for an automatic. More importantly, among the available gearboxes, only this automatic could handle the increased torque of the Cosworth engine. To make the transmission shift above 5,000 revs, where the engine delivered peak power, the gas pedal had to be pressed to kick down. At low speeds and during steady cruising on regional roads, the automatic would nervously shift up and down, even with slight throttle input. You could try to help the gearbox, but of course there was no proper manual mode in 1991. Shifts, including torque converter lockup, came with noticeable jolts. In any case, under all driving conditions, gear changes weren't as smooth as one might expect from a modern early 1990s automatic. Journalists wrote that a manual gearbox would have suited this car better. The suspension of the most powerful Scorpio was lowered by 25 millimeters, but this didn't affect comfort. The car still handled bumps well, faltering only at Autobahn joints. In corners, the vehicle remained nearly neutral, showing understeer on entry only when the speed was significantly above the limit. Very safe tuning for a large rear-wheel drive car. And the ventilated disc brakes were excellent, record deceleration figures, and virtually no fade after repeated high-speed braking. This mattered, as the top speed of the Scorpio with its 195 horsepower engine reached 225 kilometers per hour. Acceleration wasn't impressive. 0 to 100 kilometers per hour took 9.4 seconds, but considering the automatic transmission, it was quite decent. The Ghia version left little room for criticism except for the limited adjustment range of the front seat, which only tall drivers might find lacking. In contrast, rear space was abundant, and the backrests could be adjusted electrically. Interior noise at high speeds was a separate issue. Pinpointing the source was difficult. The engine was too audible, and the wind howled near the sunroof, through the front door seals, or around the rear door. On the plus side were the luxurious equipment, spacious cabin, large trunk, comfortable seats, and precise steering. The downsides included loud noise at high speeds, engine hum, erratic automatic shifts, and an overly long final drive ratio. The suspension handled bumps well, but stumbled over Autobahn joints. Overall, the impression wasn't convincing. Unlike the base Scorpio models that offered solid value, the 195 horsepower version cost 61,100 Deutsche Marks. And for that price, competitors had more than just a prestigious badge to offer. In 1991, for example, one could buy a Jeep Cherokee with a 4-liter V6, while the Land Rover Discovery was $5,000 cheaper. The Opel Senator with a 3-liter 24-valve engine cost $55,705, the same as a Mercedes 260e from the 124 series, while the 300e was priced at $65,000. A base BMW 525i in the E34 body came in at $53,000. Against this backdrop, the Ford Scorpio 24V, spacious as it was, seemed like an odd choice. However, the station wagon, introduced after the Scorpio's facelift in 1992, made far more sense for practical use. It added a roomy and functional trunk to the already large cabin, and the 2-liter 115-horsepower GLX version was priced at 43,550 marks. The test car given to journalists came with a rich set of options totaling 47,230, including nearly everything Ford offered, from metallic paint and 15-inch alloy wheels to a limited slip differential and factory alarm system. Price comparisons were inevitable. The Mercedes 124 series wagon cost $55,500, the Volkswagen Passat $34,000, the Opel Omega Caravan $35,000, and the Volvo 940 Combi $42,000. There were plenty of alternatives to the big Ford. Journalists noted early in the article that even Ford struggled to explain why, in 1985, the successor to the popular Granada debuted only as a 5-door hatchback. Statistics showed that 1/3 of Granada sales were wagons. A Ford representative explained that the Scorpio's development and launch coincided with the peak of the compact hatchback trend, while Granada was losing buyers. So the company opted for a universal solution aligned with the times, saving on body variety. They were counting on some abstract, almost theoretical new customer groups that the 5-door Scorpio might attract. Ford quickly realized its mistakes, first with the Sierra, which debuted in the early 80s, and later with the Scorpio itself. At one point, they even considered importing the American Ford Taurus wagon, but the decision-making was slow, and only by the early 90s, as part of a facelift, did they manage to create a wagon based on the Scorpio. The result was quite solid, nearly 5 meters long, about 2 meters wide, and by European standards, the car looked rather dynamic with its cargo passenger body. A wide rear pillar, a large rear overhang, and plenty of glass, German journalists noted that these lines showed no signs of a rushed decision. Unlike other manufacturers who added a trunk to a sedan or made a wagon from a model not originally designed for it. Interestingly, the Ford Scorpio Tournier wagon debuted as early as the autumn of the early 90s at the Frankfurt Motor Show, but was presented merely as a prototype to gauge public reaction. The car was essentially ready, but its launch was postponed until the facelift to avoid ordering body stamps twice. All Scorpios in the early 90s underwent exterior changes: new front fenders, a redesigned grille, white front indicators in line with the fashion of the time, and sedans received a continuous tinted plastic strip at the rear. The dashboard was updated. and the 2-liter engine unexpectedly lost power from 120 to 115 horsepower. This was done to reduce insurance costs. Still, the engine handled the heavy Scorpio well, although the soft engine mounts still caused gear lever jerks during startup or throttle changes. The wagon's top speed reached nearly 200 kilometers per hour, and acceleration to 100 took exactly 12 seconds, acceptable even by today's standards. Reaching 160 took just over 40 seconds. Fuel consumption was just under 11 liters per 100 kilometers. The test showed a bit over 10, which German journalists called moderate. The wagon's chassis differed from the base models. The rear suspension was shifted to increase trunk space, and the control arms were reinforced. Rear shock absorbers received an integrated level control system with an air cushion, and the brakes came from the most powerful Scorpio version with 24 valves. The suspension was still praised for its comfort, handling even serious bumps well, though transverse Autobahn joints remained a challenge. In fast corners, the car showed predictable front-end drift when entering too quickly, and oversteer occurred only under full load. Officially, the maximum trunk volume was around 1,500 liters, but in practice, more relevant figures were 550 under the cover or just over 1,000 with the rear seat back folded. Only the backrest folded. The cushion couldn't be removed, so a flat cargo floor wasn't possible. Journalists praised the very comfortable seats in the Ford Scorpio, but noted that the ventilation system was subpar. Draft circulated through the cabin, and directing airflow for a pleasant ride was difficult. Overall, the car was received favorably. While the sedan was deemed clumsy after a thorough test, the more practical station wagon promised a second youth for the aging large Ford. And it lived up to expectations, securing 4th place in a major comparison. In a comprehensive test of spacious wagons, the German magazine Auto, Motor und Sport assembled as many as 10 models in 1993, and the Ford Scorpio earned the title Practical. Notably, after the wagon's release, 40% of buyers opted for this body style, keeping the model afloat. All the more frustrating for Ford was the missed profit during the hatchback's production run. The price range for the wagon was wide, from a reasonable 39,422 Deutsche Marks for the base 2-liter version to 58,226 marks for the Ghia trim with a 2.9-liter V6. A large trunk, ample space for driver and passengers, and comfort even under full load, these were Scorpio's strengths compared to BMW and Audi wagons also featured in the test. However, Ford's V6 didn't earn much praise. Its 145 horsepower wasn't impressive against rivals. The engine lacked smoothness and quietness, and fuel consumption reached 13.7 liters per 100 kilometers, the same as Japanese contenders like the Mitsubishi Sigma and Toyota Camry. The most fuel-efficient was the Mercedes at 11.4 liters, while the Audi 100 and BMW 525i consumed around 12.5. Ford's practicality, highlighted in the test results, was also evident in its pricing. The Audi 100 Avant with a 2.8-liter engine crossed 62,200 marks. The BMW 525i Touring, 64,400. The Mercedes 220 TE, 61,400. While the Ford Scorpio Tournaire with its V6 was priced at 48,471 marks. That was even cheaper than the Japanese options. Toyota, for instance, asked 53,360 marks for its Camry. In 1994, Ford would release the new Scorpio, a large car with oversized headlights. A few final words, but that's a different story. The first-generation Ford Scorpio, whether the original 5-door, later sedans, or wagons, depreciated rapidly like all large Fords, attracting buyers on the used car lots. It became the coveted foreign car for many who valued a spacious cabin, comfort, low price, and relatively affordable parts. And surprisingly, despite its rather flimsy body, these cars can still occasionally be spotted on the roads.